Hello and welcome to Last Decade. The space sim is a genre that I adore, but finding the flavour you want isn't always easy. Some focus purely on combat, others on wide-arcing stories, then there are those which are more like a sandbox and promote exploration. Through the 90s there were some fantastic space sims, and Frontier is definitely my favourite. So without further ado, let's get on and have a look at Frontier Elite 2. Elite released for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron in 1984. It introduced a whole generation to the wonders of a universe within the tiny confines of a single disc or cassette. Full 3D space sim, fight and battle or simply trade and make crazy amounts of wealth. This was a game that challenged the currently established notions of video games. Games that had player lives and levels were the norm, and Elite was not that at all. Elite had a scope that was simply enormous for the time, and to be honest, even today is pretty crazy. 8 galaxies, each with 256 planets. Not even taking into account the hardware limitations of the time, having a game of such scope fit between 50 and 100 kilobytes is quite impressive. In 1993, almost 10 years later, David Braben brought us the sequel, Frontier Elite 2. Frontier stepped up the scope further with full 3D shaded graphics. The DOS version goes even further graphically, introducing texture mapping. I will say though, I'm not much a fan of these textures. I think the Amiga version does look cleaner and better, but it's still a technical feat nonetheless. It wasn't just the visuals that were improved, but the incredible amount of planets and star systems available for the players to explore. The infamous Thargoid aliens are nowhere to be found this time around. The Milky Way is split between two different factions, those being the Federation and Empire. The player can choose to align with either side or none at all. There are star systems that have no allegiance and so provide a safe haven for the player if they decide to go rogue, but we'll get into the details of all that a bit later. Frontier keeps the core gameplay elements of Elite, but makes a fundamental change to the physics. This time, realistic Newtonian physics are used for flight rather than the arcade plane style physics. All planets and stars conform to a Newtonian-like physics model with gravity and orbits. If you're feeling ambitious, you can disable the autopilot and attempt some slingshotting around planetary bodies to extend your fuel supply. Generally though, you'll want to stick to the autopilot. The physics definitely make the game more intricate and in some instances just downright infuriating when trying to engage in combat. If you take the time to learn the methods needed for combat though, you can avoid the frustration of endlessly jousting and enjoy some satisfying space combat. But let's just walk it back a bit and take a look at Frontier from the top. Frontier really goes to town, showing off its technical prowess of the time with full 3D font for its title. The intro is great to watch, and I remember viewing this as a child and being in wonderment, seeing all the different ships and planets put to the game's main music theme. Upon entering the main menu, you're given a choice of starting location. Each of the 3 options determines the difficulty of your playthrough. On your first playthrough, you'll definitely want to go by its recommendation of starting at the ROS 154 system. I'd say that if the starting positions were given a difficulty, this would be normal. With this starting position, you start off with an Eagle Mark II, missiles, fuel, and a small amount of money. You have a couple of options to start making money, and it's often best by checking the bulletin board to pick up one of the jobs. Sometimes you can get half the reward money upon accepting the job. The other is to check out ROS 154's major exports and find a system that takes one of those exports as an import. Navigating the different map screens is a little daunting at first, but there is a wealth of information. I find selling farm machinery to the Formerholt system is a good way to get started before going further afield. Starting at Mars is akin to easy mode. You begin with an Eagle that has no hyperdrive or autopilot. This isn't a problem though, as you start with a 1 Megawatt beam laser, which you can sell for a pretty penny. Selling those you can afford a Class 1 hyperdrive, autopilot and some goods to sell at Barnard's Star. You can then pick up some farm machinery to make a nice profit at ROS 154. So not a lot changes between this and the first starting point. Your ship isn't as capable, but you get a bit of a head start on being able to make a decent amount of profit. Final start position places you at Lave and as a fugitive from both the Federation and Empire. This leaves you essentially limited to independent systems. Being wanted by both factions will mean that if you visit any systems under their control, you'll end up being fired upon by police. This is a good starting point if you feel confident about your combat skills, as you'll have to navigate the more dangerous trade routes. With the extra danger though comes greater reward. If you can brave pirates and don't mind getting your hands a little dirty with illegal smuggling, this can really be a profitable start position. Maybe though, it's one to save after a couple of good runs starting at Ross 154. A fundamental aspect of the game is its time acceleration. Of course, with Frontier being a space game, the distances being travelled are unimaginable. Many trips will take days, if not weeks of in-game time. In order for you to get on with things, Frontier introduces time acceleration. The factors of time acceleration are 10, 100, 1000 and 10,000 times normal speed. What this means is that outside of hyperspace jumping, you can whack on the autopilot and just increase the time acceleration rate. Luckily, the game will drop you back to normal 1x rate if you are intercepted by an enemy or upon docking. One interesting and sometimes game-ending event that can occur is not being able to speed up to a planet or station's orbit speed. This can end up with you wildly being yanked back and forth. If you're low on fuel, this can leave you stranded, so if your sublight speed journey is quite long, think about keeping an eye on it and always keep some extra fuel. Having looked at different starting positions and time acceleration, let's have a deeper delve into money-making methods. One of the simplest methods of obtaining some extra cash is checking out the mission board. This requires no extra research of imports and exports. The amount of danger for each mission is reflected in the reward amount. Upon taking up a job, you'll be able to question your prospective employer. Their answers may give a hint as to any hidden dangers, such as being hunted by assassins. Obviously, their destination itself can be a risk too. Heading to systems outside of one of the faction's inner systems will lead you to potentially lawless systems rife with pirates. Another option for earning some cash is to join up with the military. These give you a variety of missions involving delivery, bombing, reconnaissance, or straight up assassination. Joining up gives you plenty of opportunity to increase your elite combat rating. Obviously though, you'll want to make sure your piloting skills are up to snuff. Some of these missions will grant you special permits to otherwise restricted systems, giving you access to difficult to obtain trade goods, so be on the lookout. I mentioned how Frontier made a change from the arcade-style model to a Newtonian physics-based model. So how does this change gameplay? Essentially it's based upon real-world physics in that if you're moving in a certain direction, your speed and direction will only change if force is applied. This has the advantage of once you reach a certain speed, you no longer need fuel to maintain it. Unfortunately, it means you'll need roughly the same amount of fuel and force to slow yourself down. When it comes to combat, this can make things quite difficult, as you can't just turn and face your opponent. You need to adjust your speed and direction by thrusting in the correct way. With Frontier, in general, it's best to cut off the engines and incrementally boost to the general direction of where your opponent is travelling. Try and maintain distance so that you can blast their hull into pieces. There are some good videos showing you best how to navigate in dogfights, so if you fancy some combat action, check those out first. As already discussed, trading is the bread and butter of making money in Frontier. This requires a bit more effort than simply picking up a mission, but I think it's one of the parts of the game that make it seem so large and engrossing. Before you've found a profitable route, you'll be searching through the star map to find systems and range for which you can start making some profit. Fuel cost and drive range dictate where you can go. Obviously, until you get a larger drive, you can rely on multi-jumping, but very early on the extra fuel cost will dig into your profits. It's definitely not a bad idea to maybe pick up a simple delivery mission and then take some cargo to sell at the mission's destination. To begin with, you'll want to avoid riskier routes, as you simply won't have the firepower to defend yourself from pirates unless you're already an adept dogfighter. Smuggling is part of the game I really love, and to be honest, it's where the largest gains in profit are to be made. Different systems will have different items that are deemed illegal. If you can find a buyer of these items and a stable source, you can make upwards of double your money back. The tricky part can be finding a buyer. If you look on the job board, you can find independent buyers and sellers. Some of these are legitimate, others are police officers undercover, and so you can end up with a hefty fine if trying to deal illegal goods with them. The other means of getting caught out is simply upon docking. Getting caught this way is seemingly random, but again, you can be slapped with a hefty fine. You'll find some docks will fine you more than others, so once you find a good reliable buyer and a dock where if you get fined it's minimal, you'll be on your way to the top. Sometimes buyers won't be available, so in those instances it's good to check back another time, but be prepared to occasionally be stuck with your illegal cargo. Of course, that's where finding a reliable buyer comes in, as some are there 90% of the time. Generally, this also gives you indication as to who's an undercover police officer. If you see a listing for a buying and selling, and they always seem to be there, then there's a strong chance they're a legitimate buyer. Of course, I've spoken about money making, but what about things to spend it on? Your fundamental link to the fantastic universe of Frontier is through your ship, and there is quite an array of ships to buy. There are several ship classes available to players. Shuttles, small to large fighters, and then trading ships. Shuttles are basically useless. They have next to no room for cargo or passengers. If you can fit a hyperdrive on it, that's pretty much the only thing you'll have room for. Fighters are a step up from shuttles. They can be made into capable traders for the price required. You can sell some of the unwanted systems to get a bit more cargo space and still have a ship capable of decent hyperspace range. Obviously, if you're wanting to follow the military or a mercenary route, you'll be best suited to a fighter. Trading vessels are, as the name suggests, for trading, typically large and so perfect for hauling large amounts of goods between systems. That's not to say though that they can't be decked out in hardware for fighting off enemies. Some of these come with turrets and extra gun mountings. Larger ships will also require more crew members, though this isn't much of a problem. Usually you can find a crew member on the jobs board and you can recruit them for pennies. There isn't any real interaction with the crew, they're simply needed for larger ships. As for upgrades, there are plenty to search through: lasers, missiles, tracked beams, life support systems. Some are more necessary than others. For example, don't try and leave the atmosphere without atmospheric shielding. Sounds silly, but you might buy a ship without it and forget to buy one. Autopilot is of course very important and, to be honest, mandatory. It's important to note that the weights of certain systems, such as hyperdrives, the size of the ship will determine the distance a class of drive will give you, so before upgrading, maybe save and check that it's worth fitting a particular drive. Just because a ship has a class 3 drive doesn't mean it'll go further than your class 2 drive. You might end up with a larger ship, but then you'll need a heavier jump drive that leads you to actually having a net loss in cargo space. So we've covered trading, missions and the military, but what else is there? If you fancy your hand at exploration, you can do that. It's important to note though that out of the core systems of the Federation and Empire, a vast majority of the systems are uninhabited. If you want to travel through systems without any settlements, you'll have to learn to scoop hydrogen fuel from stars directly. This is something that of course requires a fuel scoop, and a bit of practice in manoeuvring, as you need to get close enough to stars to get the fuel, but not so close that you get sucked in. I would say though that the strength of the game comes more from the trading and combat. Frontier is a fantastic game and does such a good job of painting a massive, living galaxy. In 1993 it was impressive, and to be honest, even today its size is still awe-inspiring. There's a lot of fun to be had exploring the different systems and finding crazy trade routes that will net you stacks of cash. Working towards getting a bigger and better ship definitely will keep you hooked. Sometimes it's just fun exploring the systems and seeing the orbits of all the different planets and moons. The seamless travelling from a planet's surface into space is well ahead of its time, and something that even modern games can't do. It's only a single aspect of the game, but it's one that really adds to the immersion. Taking off for the first time and steadily moving into orbit with no loading screens is just fantastic. Plotting your routes is definitely fun, though the game interface doesn't make this the simplest task to achieve. You'll probably find yourself checking trade and economy screens over and over, or writing things down to remember which systems import what. Missions can sometimes be frustrating, as it's not always clear as to whether you'll make it to your destination in time to complete it. On top of that, they can cost you money, as some missions will fine you, so really make sure that if you pick up a mission, you get on it straight away. But to be honest, there is very little wrong with Frontier Elite 2. A lot of its limitations or idiosyncrasies are simply due to its age. I can't help but feel that if the game were released with the gameplay as is, but with a more modern interface, it would completely hook a new generation of gamers. As it is though, it's a classic that every Space and DOS fan must check out. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey with Frontier Elite 2. Comment down below and let me know if you've played any of the Elite games. Have you played Elite Dangerous? And if so, which do you prefer? Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.